let's get the read on all this from Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, a doctor as well, so he carries extra clout here talking about this. Senator, what do you want to hear out of the president meeting with all these top pharmaceutical executives?
You know, I would say it's more of let's look at the facts on the ground and be rational about it. I think the good news the market was responding to today was multifold. I think that we're seeing a plateau in infections in China. And while we saw 80,000 people infected, it was mostly in one province. So, I mean, it would be alarming if all of a sudden we had another 100,000 in Beijing and in the other major capitals of China. The fact that we're not really shows that there has been some containment of this. So while it's worldwide, I think there's room for optimism that this thing may plateau out within a few weeks and not be as bad as it may have been portrayed. The other good news is it looks like children under 10 and under 20, very few of them are showing up at all in the studies. And I think that means not that they're immune to the disease, but that they're getting it in such a mild variety they're not being counted. So let's say there's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of younger people getting it who are not counted. It may well be that the mortality number is much less than has been reported. I think the other thing that's probably gone on with the stock market today is that there may be a little bit of rejoicing that they see that it's very unlikely that Bernie Sanders will now be the nominee of the Democrat Party, with Biden being stronger and with all these people leaving the race.
Well, that could be. But let me ask you a little bit about these deaths, certainly in the Seattle area. Now, they were largely elderly, most at a nursing home. And I'm just wondering right now whether that gives people the risk of false comfort. They'll hear that and say, well, the weak and feeble and all of that, when in fact, in a lot of other incidents across the world, as you know, Senator, some have been young, some have been healthy. What do you make of it?
I don't think we know yet.
Yeah.
Nobody likes to see a cluster of deaths, and I feel sorry, obviously, for the family of the 6 people who died there. But until we start seeing sort of major outbreaks where you tell me that there's 10,000 people infected in Seattle, that's when I think there'd be some really true alarm. But fortunately, we haven't seen that yet. We've seen pockets of this around the world, and even in Italy and Iran, where we have it, none of it is approaching, what started in China, the numbers there. So hopefully, if every other area is smaller than what happens in China, we may weather this storm. I think there's also some good news that there's some antiviral drugs out there that have already been developed that may well actually work. And there's a really quick study going on that will probably be done within 2 or 3 weeks. Not waiting a year for a vaccine, but actually looking at antiviral drugs that already are developed and have been used in humans and also have been used in animals and shown reactivity to the coronavirus.
You know, I know you're not a big fan of the Federal Reserve, but part of the catalyst for today's buying, Senator, was this belief that the Federal Reserve, other central banks around the world are going to coordinate a response where presumably they'll cut rates, provide cash, do whatever a central bank can to contain this. What do you think of that?
Right. I think it's always ephemeral. I mean, there were so-called reasonable people saying, oh, it'd be great just to give everybody $10,000 in cash like they're doing in Hong Kong. Well, if that's good, why don't we do it all the time? Why don't we have people line up and let's just print up a bunch of money?
Well, the president does want the Fed to do something, as you know. The president has been pushing the Fed. They're late on the mark again. They got to do something, and they're not.
But if printing up money were the answer, I think that would be a foolishness that quickly people would discover the emperor has no clothes. If it's reducing rates, it also has ramifications. So, for example, the housing crisis was preceded by a housing boom. And during that boom, interest rates never went up. Typically in a boom, when there's more competition for the money, the interest rates rise and they tamponade the effect of growth and you slow down gradually. But if you keep the interest rates below a market and there is no market of interest rates, the economy doesn't get the signal. So, yeah, you can say, oh, let's just make money cheaper and everything will be hunky-dory.
So the Federal Reserve could risk making a bad situation worse, right?
Yeah, but there are also problems to getting rid of the market signals that tell us whether we're overbuilt or underbuilt. And so I think the market signals, their price of money is the interest. It'd be like fixing the price of bread like they do in Venezuela. It's a disaster. And I think we have to be very careful about thinking that we can just fix the price of money, fix the interest rate, and make it lower, lower, lower. Why don't we make it -5? Why don't we just print up big piles of wheelbarrows of money and give it to people? Ultimately, there are ramifications to too easy money.
Do you worry about recommendations some have had to avoid crowded places, a move, of course, in Europe where they're, playing soccer games without people in the stands? The Louvre shut down for the 2nd straight day in Paris. Talk that we might have a March Madness college basketball playoff without anyone in the stands. It sounds like it's getting a little ahead of itself here.
I think so too, and I think there are reasonable times. I mean, I fly all the time, and I'm not cutting back my flying. I have to fly to my job every day. I was on a plane today. But if you told me that there were 10,000 cases in D.C., I might stay home. You know, there are going to be people who stay home if there's a big community spread of this, but there hasn't been so far. So I think being prepared is important, and I could be wrong. This could be really that bad in 2 or 3 weeks or a month. But I'm hoping that it's not going to be, and I'm not ready to sort of, buy all the toilet paper at Target yet. I think what we ought to do probably is keep watching this, do reasonable things. I'm not flying to the Wuhan province of China tomorrow, so there are certain precautions I'm taking, and I'm not going to Iran, and I'm not going to Italy right now, frankly. But I think there are reasonable things, and I think closing down like the Smithsonian's here in Washington, I think would be way premature, and I wouldn't advise something like that.
So don't pull a Louvre over here, you're saying?
Yeah, I think I don't know how many cases they have in Paris, but I don't think it's at sort of community spread levels yet in Paris. And if they've got a handful of cases in Paris, probably not the time to shut down the Louvre. But, they have to make their own decisions over there.
All right, Senator, thank you very, very much.